find that incredibly I find it incredibly cathartic to get out into the field and do that work. But it's really nice to, for a change, be able to be talking about the other side of, the other half of restoration, which is not just removing invasives, which leaves a kind of a blank spot on the landscape where other invasives or even that invasive can come back, but providing the native species side of things, where you're actually helping the ecosystem get restored back to something more along the lines of the functions that it should be serving. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about this. So I wanted to start off, if I could only advance my slides, with quickly an introduction to Sisma. So of course, we're up here in the Keweenaw. I cover Baraga, Houghton, and Keweenaw counties, but there's Sismas across the state of Michigan. So if anybody is tuning in from other places or knows family who are having invasive species issues in other places, if you just search for Sisma online, you can find a map and click on the area that you're at and get a Sisma that can help you with your invasives in any of these other counties of Michigan. So for Sisma, my mission is to facilitate cooperation and education among federal, state, tribal, and local groups and landowners to prevent and manage invasive species across land ownership boundaries, which means, I work really hard to not just focus on one individual yard, but try to get people who are connected to those yards or properties thinking about the invasives that I'm worried about as well, and to foster native, aquatic, and terrestrial communities. So it's not just for me about removing invasives, but it's about restoration to try to get back our native communities that are being lost because of the invasions of plants that don't belong here. I work with partners, a broad range of partners, federal, tribal, federal, state, local conservancies, the Nature Conservancy, Keweenaw Land Trust, DNR, Upper Peninsula Resource Conservation Development Council, and some forestry groups. And then I get my funding through writing grants through the DNR, which is the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, and then through the Forest Service and Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And this past year, I partnered with the Park Service to help with aquatic invasive education. So through the years, starting in 2017 was when my first major funding came through. I took this position in late 2015, and then it took me about a year to get a grant funded. And so since that time, though, I've had continuous funding and have had the exciting opportunity to work with a bunch of different groups of students. So here's the years of different students. And this past year, we actually added an aquatic invasive species crew that did both boat washes and European frog bit surveying, which I'm happy to say we don't have here yet, but it is in the Wisconsin-Michigan border. So please clean, drain, dry your boats and recreational vehicles. So just briefly to get us all on the same page about what I'm talking about with invasive species. Imagine this screen could be filled with all of the different species, plant species growing in the Midwest. And then there's a subset of these species that are not native to Michigan, meaning that they're from some other place in the country or the world. And then there's a subset of these species that can be found in the Midwest that cause harm to our ecology, economy, or human health. Things like poison ivy, which is native to Michigan, we get rashes from it. Ragweeds, which are native to Michigan, cause severe allergies. But what I'm really talking about is the intersection of invasive species, or the intersection of this cause harm and not native, and that's what invasive species are. And so invasive species, due to the absence of limited herbivores and competitors of its native range, outcompete native species and cause harm to the environment, economy, and human health. And that's specifically what I'm focusing on. And unfortunately, invaders are of these plant species are still available in many different nurseries across our country. So the plant trade industry still makes money from selling invasive species. So we have regulated species, 50% of our regulated species. So 343 species of an available list of, I think, 1,285 that they looked at. Total, yeah, all species, 1,285. 343 of these species from the regulated species lists are still available in the plant trade industry. And that goes, so we have 50% for that list, all the way up to 83% of imported ornamentals are still available in the plant trade industry. So you can walk into a store and buy many noxious invasive species still and plant them in your yard. And that is what we're trying to fight against. So the first step is for you guys and me and anybody who's trying to plant native species is to walk into our nurseries and start asking for them. But why would you want to do that? Why do we care about what species we are planting? So plant choice matters. And I'm going to be stealing a bunch of my information from what I think has got to be the most famous entomologist of our modern times, Dr. Douglas Ptolemy. And he has recently published a book called Nature's Best Hope. And he outlines why plant choice matters. But before that, he actually had Nature in Your Backyard. So like how, I don't think I said that the title right, but Bringing Nature Home. Why getting nature back into your backyard is really important. So plants are more than decorations. Plants are critical components of the ecosystem because they provide connections with, and since I'm a forest ecologist, soil organisms are what builds our soil and helps with decomposition and the flow of nutrients and houses soil insects. And then you have insects, flying insects, crawling insects, amphibians, birds, mammals, including us. So plants are critical components to all of that range of food web members. And if you don't have organisms eating the plants that we have in the area and passing on the energy that they harness, the rest of the food web collapses, and we have biological or biodiversity crises. Non-native plants, and then I'm talking again, particularly about the invasive plants. So not only that they're non-native, but that they cause harm, that they outcompete our natives, or that they cause other problems, are poor at passing along their energy and supporting those organisms. And that's the key to understanding why natives are so important. So I just want to share from Bringing Nature Home, the book that I couldn't remember the title of, a quote about what Doug Ptolemy is really trying to impress upon people in, I think, a really beautiful way. So unless we modify the places we live, work, and play to meet not only our own needs, but the needs of other species as well, nearly all species of wildlife native to the United States will disappear forever. This is not a speculation. Our preserves and national parks are not adequate to prevent the predicted loss of species, and we have run out of space required to make them big enough. For conservationists, and indeed for everyone who celebrates life on Earth, this is perhaps the direst possible consequence of human enterprise. So basically what he's saying is we're running out of time to make up for the habitat that we have lost. And so you guys, and I think that's why you're part of Wild Ones and interested in this talk, are the answers to helping with this crisis. So what crisis? Well, these two papers were published in the last few years. We've lost 75% of our total flying insect biomass in the last 30 years now. So I think maybe a lot of you might be around my age. You know, when you drive from one place to another in Michigan, it used to be that you'd have to stop at gas stations along the way and get your windshield wipers, your windshield cleaned, because your wipers couldn't wipe away all of the bug biomass that was splattered on your windshield. I can now drive from one end of the UP to the other, and on certain days, not have to worry about cleaning my screen at all, my windshield screen at all. So I think we're all seeing direct evidence of that biomass decline. And not only have insect biomass, has there been a decline in insect biomass, but we've also seen a decline in bird, the number of birds out there. So, we have species crashing, but 30% of our birds, total bird population has been lost since the 1970s. So we are seeing this happening. And so what can we do to help? And though it's not, those crashes in insects and birds isn't directly linked to invasive species, it is directly linked to the habitat loss for those species. So biodiversity is part of what makes a place great to live for our insects, our birds, everything else. And every time we build a house, every time we cut a tree, every time we mow our grass, we are changing the habitat and making it so that it's harder for insects and then birds that feed on insects to survive. So that's what we're talking about. So Doug Ptolemy walks us through, and I have the source here. You can Google Doug Ptolemy and you can get a huge number of podcasts that have interviewed him. And that's why he's like the superstar of entomology now. It's crazy cool to have a scientist so popular in the popular literature. So I listened to this one particular podcast, really enjoyed the information. He walks us through the steps of what we need to do to restore habitat in our own home spaces. And he makes a really good argument for why we need to do them. I'm going to focus on this group of these steps, but the first step is to reduce lawn space. Lawns are biodiversity deserts. They don't create, you usually mow your lawn before you get any seed heads or flowers, so the pollinators don't have anything. And they're essentially monocultures. You might have a few weedy species in there, but they're not providing anything to our native insects to really eat, and then therefore not the birds either. We want to remove invasive species. 85% of our invasive woody plants in the US are escapees from our gardens. So yeah, we created the problem, and yeah, we can fix the problem. Let's see. His next step is to plant keystone species. And what he means by that is that 75% of our insects, the food for our insects, comes from 5% of our plants. So if you want to strategize about what are the high impact species to plant, that would be a really good way to start filling in your yard with certain species. And that includes things like goldenrods, if you're talking about perennials, shrubs like willow, and trees like oak. So pretty common things, but really important keystone species to plant in our yard. Be generous with plantings. All layers of plants, from ground covers to herbaceous to shrub to tree layers, because that vertical diversity provides different niches for different types of insects and different birds. Plant for specialized pollinators. If you shoot for planting for specialized pollinators, you will nail all of the generalists as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Why do we care about generalists versus specialists? Network with your neighbors to creating habitat connectivity. And so that's important for, even things like the monarch butterfly that's so famous now, with all the efforts to bring back our monarch butterfly habitat. They can fly from Mexico all the way up here, but they need places to stop and eat as they go. And if we don't have that connectivity for them to do that from place to place, then they're not going to be able to make it. And so within your own yard, you have species that are moving along. And if they hit a desert of grass in between yards of pollinators, it's not going to help them. Create conservation hardscapes. So cover window wells where frogs and toads can fall into them and not be able to hop back out. Reduce artificial lighting. I don't know if you guys have ever read the literature about the impacts of artificial lighting on the movement of our mammals and our night birds like owls. It's pretty devastating to read, especially when you consider how many lights are out there through the night. So it changes predation, it changes the movements and the ability for animals who are adapted to the night to forage because they can't see properly. There's a lot of changes involved, let alone the fact that we can no longer see our stars. So changing artificial lighting is a really important concept for a lot of different fronts. Create pupation, caterpillar pupation sites. The reason the way you do that is to leave unraked leaves in your yard. And then don't spray pesticides or fertilizers. Homeowners spray more insecticide per acre on average than the entire agricultural industry. Interesting, horrible fact. One thing I wanted to mention about removing invasive species. East of the Mississippi, 86% of our land is privately owned. And if those private landowners were to control the invasive species, we would have 86% of less invasive species, or 86% of our land managed of invasive species. So that's just an interesting thing to realize.
Oh, Sigrid?
Yep.
I just wanted to let everybody know that if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat, and Sigrid can answer it after she's done with her talk.
Yeah, that would probably be easier. So some resources for you to figure out what species you should be planting, or maybe to help you report invasive species that you know you have and you want to get those mapped. So MIPIN, the Midwest Invasive Species Plant Network, has this app that's called Landscape Alternatives. And what it's really cool with this app is it has a list of invasive species that you might have in your yard. And then it provides different alternative landscapes or landscaping plants that would be similar and maybe in look or height to what that invasive was, and suggest what you can replace it with. And that's all on a phone, or a phone app, an iOS or Android. So I highly recommend getting that if you like to work with technology. For reporting, the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, which is housed at Michigan State University, has an app that allows you to report a spot on your landscape where you're at of any invasives that you have found. So both of those are great app resources. If you're more interested in looking things up online, here's a whole list of resources, and there's many, many more out there. But places to find native plant ideas include things like WIGGLE, which is the Woody Invasives Great Lake Collaborative. And so that, hopefully it's going to link, is this website. And right here, they have this landscape alternatives tab. And within that, You can look for trees, shrubs, vines, and ground cover galleries. And they also give you a list of different woody invasives that are out there. And you can look up what those look like. And then if you click on any of these, so for instance, Tartarian honeysuckle, which is one that we have up here. If you click on that, it shows you what a Tartarian honeysuckle looks like. Gives you lots of different cool pictures, tells you what the distribution is, the spread is, and then it has, for that particular species, the different landscape alternatives. Now, the one thing that they don't pay attention to, or that they have consciously chosen to include, is cultivars in their species, their native alternative lists. And so there's still research that has to be done on cultivars of different species, cultivars of native species even. When you are breeding plants, you're changing the secondary compounds and leaves. You might be changing, the different ratios of carbohydrates to lignins. And what you get with that is possibly plants that would, if they were still their native unbred version, have fed insects just perfectly. Or you could be breeding in a different component that makes it so the insects no longer can feed off that plant. And it all depends on the kinds of insects you're talking about and how the plant's changed. But that is the risk of using cultivars. So really, if you're putting money and time into trying to restore your backyard to a more native environment, I would say avoid the cultivars and go with pure native species that are recognizable. Oh, okay. Another place that you can go for plants that can be useful is this website. No, is this in the way? This is through the National Wildlife Foundation.
I can see the website.
Okay, you can. I have this funny, Zoom has put a strip of choices across it for me, so I can't actually see it. So as long as you can. So you go to this website, you can set your location with our zip code. And then it will make suggestions for native plants that you might want to grow, or what kinds of butterflies might be here. And then you can save them into a list. And so we can pick native plants. There's flowers and grasses, trees and shrubs. And what's really cool about this, and they're still filling out pictures in here, but what's really cool about this is if you can see this spot right here, it tells you how many different pollinators use that range of species. So goldenrod, 135 different kinds of butterflies use different goldenrods. So there's a keystone species, right? You have so many of them that can eat different goldenrods. And we have a lot of native goldenrods up here. So, great bang for the buck in terms of helping with native insects in your backyard. And now, see if I can come back here. Okay, so there's the NWF website that I was just at. This website here, I'm not going to click on it. For some reason, just in the past week, it's no longer functional. So, but it was a Michigan State website that gave plant choices, and it was really fantastic. So I'm hoping it's just temporarily down. And then this gardenia.net website, this one provides excellent resources for ID of invasives, for suggesting natives. And what I want you to think about, though, is if it's on a website and it's being suggested to you as a plant for you to plant in your neighborhood, I would like you to cross-reference that with a native species list specific to our area, because these tend to be meant and useful for broad regions of the country. It doesn't mean that all species on their list is appropriate or applicable to our area. So I'll show you a list that Sisma has just created that are a bunch of native species, but you can also use maps from Prairie Moon Nursery, from Prairie Nursery, and the University of Michigan online herbarium to help with finding native plants. And also there's a switch back here. We have Designs by Nature, which is an upper, it's in Marquette, but they provide native plants for our area. And so you can get different lists of plants. You can get mixtures of plant flats to plant. And so you have a plant list of what they sell and what's, so what's available through them. But you can also Google, I can't see what I'm typing. Nope. Let's see, Prairie. Yep, Prairie Moon Nursery. And then you can do the same with Prairie Nursery, and you can type in different species, or you can search through their lists. And what's really cool that they do is they allow you to sort their lists specifically for Michigan. And that still might include species that are only really applicable to more southern Michigan. So you'll still want to make sure that anything you're selecting is really appropriate for the UP. And then I will go back to, maybe I'll go back to my Zoom. So that's what these resources are on this page. And then what I have done with Sisma, and you can find it on my webpage, is I've created, it's a long table, and I've broken it up into trees and shrubs and moist perennials and dryland perennials and sedges and grasses. And so you just scroll through the list. But what this list will show you is if it's native to the UP, it will have a leaf shape there in that column. If it's native regionally, that is the northern half of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, it will have a leaf in that column. And then if it's available at Designs by Nature, that Marquette place, it will have a leaf in that column. Available at Prairie Moon Nursery in Minnesota, it will be available, or it will have a leaf in that column. And then available at Prairie Nursery in Wisconsin, it will be in that column. So you can actually look through this list, find the species that you want to try to buy, and it will tell you if it's available from those 3 nurseries. Of course, there's plenty of other nurseries out there, and you might have a favorite, and it would be nice to go to our local nurseries and ask them to carry some of these native species, which is actually Sisma's next step with this list. I created it with the nurseries in mind, so I could say, hey, here's a list of a bunch of natives that you could bring into your nursery. And hopefully they eventually will, but it will again take you consumers to go to them and start asking for those native species. Incidentally, there's been a study recently done on nursery stock and what brings them more money. And it turns out when they sell an invasive species, they make more money from an invasive species sale on average than they do a native species sale. So you're actually saving yourself a bit of money by demanding native. Just a little aside. So those are the resources part of my talk. I wanted to share why I'm interested in showing you native replacements, and then I wanted to show you where some of the resources you could go to. So the Sisma website, along with all of the other nurseries and the extra information. And I've shared this PDF of this talk with Marcia so that you don't have to take notes. You'll be able to get a copy of this talk and get those resources. And you can go to the Sisma website and get the species list. All right, so moving on to, I'm going to be addressing all strata for the vertical diversity concept of many different niches for many different species. So I'm going to cover ground cover, what not to plant, followed by what you could replace your invasive ground cover with if you already have invasive ground cover. Same with tall herbaceous, what not to plant, what to plant instead, shrubs, what not to plant, what to plant instead, and trees the same. So that's going to be the rest of the talk. So don't plant these ground cover plants and bulbs. If we were in person, I was going to do a quiz. What is this species? So this is, there's a mixture here of either greater or lesser periwinkle. They're Vinca major, Vinca minor. Vinca minor tends to be more, I guess, more greatly distributed across the United States, but Vinca major is also all over the place. You can tell the difference by the leaf blade shapes. Mostly you probably recognize this by the periwinkle flower that's so common. And what's worrisome about this species is that it grows in the shade, which means that it invades the understory of our forests and causes problems with our forest tree reproduction, along with losing all the herbaceous community that should be here. So here's an example. This is right here in Houghton of Vinca minor that actually moved into this forest. And the only thing that can really grow with it are some ferns. And then there's a few other invasives right along this trail, which are actually Myosota species, forget-me-nots. So, which is another, we have some native forget-me-nots, but most of the ones you see growing in the forest are invasive forget-me-nots. So I'm going to share a little bit about removal methods in this talk, but very little. If you have an invasive species of concern in your yard, feel free to contact Sisma. We will come and help you, but I wanted to focus this talk not as much on removal methods, but more on here's what you should plant instead of the invasive, and Sisma is available to help with suggestions for invasive species removal. But for Vinca, the most common suggestion that you can find, if you mow, rake it, dig it up, it will resprout unless you get every single trace of that plant, which is near impossible because they're rhizomatous, which means they grow through the soil with roots of various depths, and a root fragment will grow a whole new plant. So you're not really going to be able to get rid of it by digging them up. So what we really suggest is, some of my friends are working on this. You use cardboard and cover them with cardboard. By the time the cardboard decomposes, you've probably snuffed out that portion of the plants, and you can start replacing them. You could put potted plants on the cardboard while that process is happening, maybe even cover it with bark mulch so that you don't see the cardboard. But you have to smother these plants thoroughly, and you have to get all of them. So, in a space like this where it's spread out throughout this forest, start at one edge and maybe through the years, just keep moving around. Or if you feel really gung-ho, cover it all and leave it for a couple of years or a year at least, and then start interplanting good shade, good competitors to help replace that plant. Goutweed or snow on the mountain. I prefer goutweed because it sounds less pretty. Snow on the mountain makes people want to buy it. This is what it looks like. Removal methods are basically the same as Vinca. It's very aggressive plant that grows with rhizomatous growth in the soil. You want to, smother it, and you can do it piecemeal or you can do it all at once. But the only way to get rid of this is to do that. If you keep mowing it, it will just keep resprouting. Lily of the Valley. this garden here that I'm showing with my cat growing in it, not growing, my cat in it. This was empty soil with a few weeds. This was before I knew that lily of the valley was an invasive species. So this was way back in like 2006 or 2007 that I did this. And there happened to be some lily of the valley growing in the forest next to my house. So we planted a few of them here and they took over the garden. So now we are trying to get, so that's a nodding head trillium in there, and we're actually working in some Solomon seal and some other things into this garden. You can see a false Solomon seal right in here. And so there's another garden that I have that's actually, I've done much better. It turns out lily of the valley is easier to remove than goutweed or vinca because it's mostly bulbs. So you can dig them up and as you replace them with some other vegetation, they will go away. So what should you replace those ground cover with? Partridge berry is a good example. You might have noticed this out hiking on any of our trails. It's actually pretty ubiquitous, but absolutely native. Has these incredible red berries that make it really pretty. This slightly striped leaf that makes it really pretty. Very low to the ground. It overwinters with those berries on it, so it provides mammals plenty of food and birds. And it grows in a variety of soils, tolerates dry soils. But if you're going to put in dry soils, you'll probably want to water it consistently, but it tolerates it quite well. It grows in the shade. It's just in it. You can propagate it. It's very difficult to start from seed according to websites, but you can propagate it from cuttings. So if you have a friend that has some in their yard, ask for some cuttings or divide it up. The Forest Service asks you not to go and harvest this from public lands though. So stick to private lands and ask people if you can have some of their plant. Additional ground cover possibilities, ideas that came from Prairie Moon Nursery are things like common blue violet or wild strawberry or pussy toes if you have a really a drier area. And look how gorgeous that is and really great for insects. Grows in a variety of different conditions. Pussy toes in particular is a larval host for this specialist, American painted lady. So really good ideas for the ground cover. And then getting slightly taller are wild lily of the valley or Canada Mayflower, same thing, Myanthemum canadense. That's over here. Beautiful little flowers. And then you have false lily of the valley, which is now Myanthemum maricimosum. It used to be Smilacina, but they've changed the name. But these are gorgeous plants that do well in shade and or sun. They spread by rhizomes as well, just not as aggressively and not as quickly as those invasives that you're replacing. And then they cater to 3 different species, especially this Myanthemum canadense. 3 different species of butterflies and moths use this as a caterpillar host plant. So very good for insects, for specific insects. And then this is sort of what you might get, and if you're not trying hard, which is sort of my approach to gardening, don't try hard. And so this is wild lily of the valley growing beneath an old stump that's decomposing. I didn't put it there. This wild lily of the valley volunteered in, but I live right near a forest, so it's just coming from forest habitat. And then here's Myanthemum stellatum, which is the starry Solomon's plume with prairie smoke. And then, so you could get lots of beautiful ideas from Prairie Moon Nursery or from Prairie Nursery in Wisconsin on different combinations of plants. Don't plant these taller plants, or taller herbaceous plants. All of the following came to our area as landscaping species and have spread and continue to spread in our native forests or wetlands. So purple loosestrife. I'm still working on controlling that in different areas, different wetlands and along our roads where they spread with thousands of seeds that they send out. They have square stems, long lanceolate leaves. They have that kind of scalloped webbing to their leaves, and this large stalks of beautiful purple flowers that generalist insects appreciate, but are no good for our specialist insects. And they invade our wetlands, which are some of the most diverse places on our landscape. And they take that diversity and create a monoculture if given the chance. And that makes it difficult for almost any species that would utilize that wetland to continue to use it as habitat. Let's see, so they're very hardy. So Kisma, what do we do with them? If it's a small patch, we'll dig up the roots. We cut and bag the flowers to stop that the thousands of seeds get spread out by them, but biological control is where we've gone. So if you see these little Gallericella beetles in this picture, I go and collect those from other sites and I bring them to purple loosestrife in our area, and they do a good job of, with enough population of them, eating so many holes in the leaves of the purple loosestrife that it can hinder the purple loosestrife flowering. And the more that happens year after year, as those populations of this Gallericella beetle gets established, the lower the productivity of the purple loosestrife, which then allows the native plants in the area to compete. So basically what it's doing is it's introducing a native to the purple loosestrife, a native biological control that isn't going to kill purple loosestrife completely in most places, although sometimes it can completely wipe it out. But what it does is it controls the productivity of purple loosestrife so that it will share the sandbox better, so to speak, with the other companion normal community of that wetland. And so we don't need to get rid of purple loosestrife 100%. We just need to make sure that it's not in dense monocultures. And that's what this Gallericella beetle is doing. So if you drive along 41 and you wonder why Kisma isn't working harder to get rid of all the purple loosestrife you might see along US 41, I would say we are digging out some patches of it, but it's really because the ditching along the roads is such a disturbed area with mowing that happens and salt that goes in there, and it's just a really disturbed area. The likelihood of me being able to get rid of all of the purple loosestrife by digging it out is, I just don't have that kind of funding. So what these Gallericella beetles are doing is they're using that plant for energy, and they are helping to control those populations so that they don't become monocultures. So almost any place along US 41 where you see purple loosestrife growing, you can go in there and you'll find a bunch of holes in the leaves that show that Gallericella beetle is doing its job. Here's a new to me to manage species in our area, unfortunately. Funny story about this one is last fall, I was in Marquette for my daughter's cross-country running race. And I saw this plant growing along a road in Marquette. And I said, what is that? And then I remember vaguely from Sisma education stuff that it was something called Butterbur. And it looks like giant out of control rhubarb. And it's not edible like rhubarb, but that's what it looked like to me. And I looked it up and learned about it and thought, thank goodness I don't have that in Kisma. And then I swear a month later, a woman called me and said, 20 years ago, I planted a 4 square foot patch of this Butterbur. And now 20 years later, it's now about a half an acre. And it's running all along my stream that flows out into a little inland lake. And I'm afraid that if it hits the coast, it's just going to spread all around the lake. And it's all my fault, and I need help controlling it. So we're doing a cut and cover approach where we're smothering it. And then eventually she'll be able to get natives back into this area. But that's what happens when you play with plants that don't belong here. and she's learned a hard lesson and feels really badly about it and is taking responsibility, which is wonderful. And so we're helping her, and hopefully it will all go well. But it starts off as this, it's just only a few inches tall, this little stalk of a plant, and then it grows to being 3 to 4 feet tall, and like I said, somewhat similar to rhubarb. Dame's Rocket. Some of you might recognize this flower. It's in the mustard family, like garlic mustard, which you might have heard of, that we don't want growing in our yards because it invades forests. This one invades forests as well. Threat to biodiversity, not really used by insects, our native insects, and is often in seed sources that or seed mix packets that you get for free. So 4 petals is its distinction. The garlic or the mustard family all have 4 petals to their flowers. So the first year of this is a rosette. Looks like this little picture here that overwinters, and then it shoots up these stalks of flowers with many, many seeds. So what do you want to put in your yard in place of those invasives? Fireweed, which looks a lot like purple loosestrife to some people. A perfect, wonderful plant to replace any wet areas in your yard. Blue vervain, another moist soil, beautiful purple flowered moist soil plant. Marsh milkweed or swamp milkweed is another name for it. Excuse me, Joe Pieweed. All of those are great for wet soils. Goldenrods. Goldenrods are, like I said, one of the keystone herbaceous species that feeds so many different butterflies and pollinators. There's a goldenrod for all of our habitats, from wet to dry soils and from sunny to shady areas. Some people might confuse these with the species of plant that causes allergies. And as I mentioned earlier, ragweed is the species that causes severe allergies for many of us, especially in the later summer. They happen to bloom at the same time as goldenrod. Their flowers are whitish green and you barely notice them, but their pollen is, very upsetting to some of us who have seasonal allergies. Goldenrod is not that plant. And so don't fear goldenrod for being a highly allergy inducing plant. Do plant goldenrod. And so here, this isn't even all the goldenrods that are native to our area. These are just different pictures I chose from Prairie Moon Nursery, but these are all available at Prairie Moon Nursery. And so this is just a really a great plant to choose, especially for carrying your flowering season into the fall. And then here's just a smattering of the 135 butterfly caterpillar host caterpillars that become the butterflies that we love to see around. So this is a host plant to all of these. Blazing star, little blue stem, maidenhair fern, all add interest and color to your gardens at different times of year. One of the things you want to think about is, and I've got these descriptions and I'm not going to run through all of them, but one of the things you might want to think about when you're creating your backyard or yard gardens is to provide inflorescence or flowers at different times of the year all throughout the growing season. So both Prairie Moon and Prairie Nursery and Designs by Nature all will help you pick flowers that have that flower. Some will flower in the spring, some will flower in the summer, some will flower in the fall, and it helps you carry that food source through to all the different pollinators that visit your yard. Jack in the Pulpit. This is such a cool plant, and I happen to have some that volunteered into my garden. I absolutely love them. They are growing more and more each year. Get added. They have the seed head. They're hard to start from seed if you buy them from the nursery, but because they are part of the soil matrix already here, these seeds fall off, and after overwintering, they'll start to create new plants. And you have to put them through a cold chill spell before they'll become new plants, and not all of them germinate. So it is a little tricky, I hear, but if you bring in some native soil with your Jack in the Pulpit, I don't think you'll have a problem. You can buy them, you can buy plants and get them started that way instead of by seed. And then birds and mammals eat the berries. So one of the coolest things that I learned, I guess maybe many months ago, this past summer, I happened to be reading about Jack in the Pulpit, and there's a pollinator that's called a fungus gnat that's attracted to the slight fungal odor of that emanates from the flower. So once the pollen gnat enters into a male flower, because there's male and female flowers for Jack in the Pulpit, they crawl around and get themselves all coated with pollen, and then they crawl out this little hole at the base of the flower. And then they fly around and find another flower, and they do the same thing. And then they might end up flying into a female flower where they coat the female parts with all the pollen that they've collected from all the male flowers they delivered. And then unfortunately for the gnats, they don't have a hole at the bottom of the female flower. So that's where they end their life, but they've done their pollinator thing and they've done their mating thing for themselves. And that's their cool pollination story for Jack in the Pulpit. Only the male flowers have this little escape hatch at the base of the flower. And then, they could crawl out the top if they were really resourceful, but apparently they tend to crawl down. So cool little story about Jack in the Pulpit. Solomon seal. This particular species of Solomon seal is actually not specifically native to our area. It's native to southern Michigan, or you could find it in southern Michigan. There are more of it. You'll see reports on a map of it growing up here, and that's probably because people have planted it. And it is very closely related to our native Solomon seal, which is Polygonatum pubescens. And so I don't really know what to say about this. It's available and said to be native. You can buy this at several places that cater to native plants for the UP. So it's going to be planted. And with climate change, maybe it would be volunteering up here eventually on its own. And hopefully the insects that eat our pubescens, or rather visit our pubescens, would also visit this particular Solomon seal. But this one is, it sort of falls on a fine line of really, is it really native here? It's native broadly regionally here. One interesting thing about Solomon seal and false Solomon seal is there's a little rhyme that goes with telling them apart. So if you've ever noticed something that looks much like Solomon seal, but the flowers are only at the end, whereas real Solomon seal has them all along the stem, the rhyme goes, Solomon seal, to be real, must have flowers along its keel. So when you see the flowers distributed along the stem, that's true Solomon seal. And when you don't, that's false Solomon seal. And this again is great for pollinators and birds. Hopefully up here, that species will do. So Prairie Moon Nursery again, and also Prairie Nursery does this too, will provide, so you pick a plant that you really like, and then it will say this pairs with, and then you can look at the other plants that it suggests. And then you also want to pay attention again that the plant that it suggests is actually from our area. So they have maps. If I were to click on any one of these plants in the website, it would give me ability to access a map that shows specifically what counties in our area you can find these different plants. So really good resource for both buying the plants and finding out if they're native. All right, speeding through this, I probably have to move a little faster. Yes, don't plant these shrubs. Wow, I must have talked too much. So knotweed, which isn't a true shrub. This is actually an herbaceous species. It dies back every year, as you can see in this picture. It's just an herbaceous species, not a shrub, not a woody shrub, but people think of it as a shrub because of how big it grows. Don't plant this. It's one of my nemesis here. Some of you might remember what the quilt shop the neighboring plot of land next to the parking lot of the quilt shop on 41 looked like. Used to have 14-foot giant knotweed growing there. And then after a few years of me doing what I call the cut and cover approach, where I smother stems of knotweed and then pile cut stems of knotweed onto the material I'm smothering the other stems with, every 2 weeks through the summer season, every 2 weeks, we go back and cut all of this material. And then eventually things like solidago, goldenrod species have volunteered in. Some less desirable species also have come in, like Queen Anne's lace, which is native to Europe, and a few other things like that. But I've had elderberry shrubs volunteer in. I have some of the forest making saplings or seedlings and saplings that are coming in. So eventually we're hoping to get this reforested. I've planted a bunch of spruces and pines in there. So hopefully we're going to get shade back to this area, and then the shade will drive the knotweed the rest of the way out. Or now when I do plots, vegetation plots there, I don't see and I don't find knotweed in those plots. So we're almost there. Can't say we've completely killed it, but we're almost there. We'll continue to go back to that site year after year. Common buckthorn, you'll find this in your yard. If you're in Houghton, this is what it looks like in the forest. On the right side of this photo, I've only cut the seed trees out, but I've left the understory buckthorn that's invaded in there. And on the left side here, all buckthorn's been removed. And so this is just native shrubs and some things that I've native tree and shrub species that I'm planting back into it to restore that area. But this is a demonstration site on the Tolkien trails with signs telling you how to identify buckthorn and how we're managing it there. Glossy buckthorn, Frangula alnus, is another buckthorn species that tends to be more of a wetland buckthorn species, but it will also do uplands. If you've ever been to the Swedetown Trail system, you'll see that they have a huge glossy buckthorn problem. This is what a wall of glossy buckthorn looks like. This is actually a new infestation within the last 10 years at Mastohito.
Just a second, Sigrid, just to interrupt a bit. We're at 7 o'clock, and some people may have to leave, but we are making a recording of this, and it will be available on the Wild Ones website. So if you need to leave, you can catch the end of it later.
Okay. I apologize for running long. I'm excited to share a lot of different information. So yeah, I'll speed through some of this, but the honeysuckle. Invasive honeysuckle, the way to tell invasive honeysuckle, not only do its flowers look very different from our native honeysuckle, and we do have native honeysuckle, but if you cut a second year stem or older of invasive honeysuckle, it will always have a hole where the pith is. And our native honeysuckle, it's a solid pith. So if you're wondering and you looked up honeysuckle and you're not quite sure by the flowers, you can definitely tell by cutting an older twig. Privet is brand new to our forests in terms of invading. Somebody within a bird's fly from the birch loop of the main tech trails has privet growing, and a bird taking some of these fruits dropped it there, and my crew worked on an 8-acre not dense infestation, but scattered infestation through 8 acres of that area of the tech trails. So definitely Ligustrum obtusifolium is up here, and keep an eye out for it and don't plant it in your yard. Privets, let's see, I have a stat on privets. 9 species of ornamental privet have invaded greater than 1 million acres of natural areas in the eastern US. And now up here, barberry, horrible, horrible, horrible shrub that's still being sold, including lots of cultivars of barberry. That's what it looks like in our forest, and that's a picture I took from our forests. The berries that you see in this upper picture on the right are what mammals carry around and spread, and birds will spread far and wide. They are a contributor to Lyme disease. In studies back east, in Connecticut specifically, they found that there were 120 ticks per acre in barberry infested forests versus forests without barberry had only 10 ticks per acre. And then we're talking about deer ticks that carry Lyme disease. So a health problem here as Lyme disease has moved into our area. And so be aware, don't plant this species. Here is another picture I took with it in the understory of an emerald ash borer killed ash tree swamp. And so barberry is preferentially invading into those areas from neighboring yards. And I wanted you to know that even though you can buy cultivars that claim that they are seedless, there is a great study cited here that shows that even seedless cultivars, given enough time to mature, will start to produce seed. Those seed do germinate in our native forests. And so there is no such thing yet of barberry that's seedless through time. And then autumn olive looks like this, and infestation looks like that. Burning bush, I've seen it around in the falls. It's very obvious. It's beautiful, has beautiful red foliage. Totally understand why people like burning bush. But I would say that we don't have it invading in our forest that I have found yet, but it is an aggressive invader south of us. So I'm thinking right now it's just in the phase of getting itself established here, and then it will start to take off, and we'll be beyond that control curve if we continue to allow people to plant it and get it established here. So don't do burning bush. Do things like winterberry. This beautiful shrub grows in wetter soils, partial shade to sunny sites. This is what the flowers look like in the spring. The fruits are what makes it fabulous through the winter because birds can utilize it and get food from it all winter long. Willows, again, a really great source of food for a lot of our native insects. High bush cranberry here in the middle, and then dogwoods, especially red osier dogwood, but there's several others that are great for pollinators and birds. Here's some other amelanchier species that's serviceberry. So there's many different serviceberries. They're hard to tell apart. They hybridize like crazy. So most people just call it an amelanchier species, but there's other dogwoods that you can plant. Beautiful trees and shrubs, or rather beautiful small trees, and great for our wildlife. Norway, so now moving on to trees, Norway maple. You probably all know what Norway maple looks like by this tar spot, which is a fungus that is also not native, and luckily for us is only attacking, for the most part, Norway maple. And then maybe you haven't heard of this species, tree of heaven. There is one growing in Ripley, and it actually is a host to a particular species of insect that is dangerous for all of our fruit trees and some of our native trees. Hasn't made it to Michigan yet, but you don't want to have this species here. Oh, and then I probably didn't say what the insect was. It's called spotted lanternfly. You might have heard about it in the news. Not here yet, but we want to keep it out. It will eat our apples, plums, cherries, and grapes, and our forest trees such as oaks, willows, maples, and sycamores. They're sap suckers and eventually will kill the tree. So that tree of heaven's a host to the spotted lanternfly, so we want to keep it out of here. So what trees to plant in their place? Quercus rubrum, red oak, red and sugar maple and basswood are really nice overstory trees to plant in place of Norway maple and tree of heaven. And oaks in particular are, again, one of the keystone species that feeds so many moths and butterflies, caterpillars. And then this is that NWF site again that gives you all these different trees that you could plant in their place and the different amounts of caterpillars or butterflies and moths that it caters to. So these, all of these species would just be grand up here. Hawthorn, Crataegus species, great for birds because of the berries, but also great for pollinators. So again, I think if you go to the NWF site, you can get this information. Just a summary slide showing don't plant the things on the left, plant the things on the right. And then questions. And I'll leave this up for a few minutes if somebody wants to actually write a few things down. But like I said, I've shared this with Marcia. So sorry, I ran long. And now I can take questions.
That's okay. It's been really interesting.
I hope that was helpful.
Okay, I'm scrolling through the chat right now. And the first question is, why shouldn't we use fertilizers?
Well, fertilizers are additional nutrients that go in your yard, and we live really close to water supply. And when it rains, the water floods that nutrients out of your yard downhill into our waters. And I don't know if you've heard of the algal bloom issue that Lake Erie has. Well, Lake Superior just had their first one too. And all of that is because of additional nutrients going into our water supply. Our native plants, both our forest, all of our forest species are adapted actually to relatively low nutrient soils. And so when you add nutrients to the soil, you tend to be catering to those invasive species that can outcompete our native species in higher nutrient soils at a faster rate.
Yes. I regularly tell people, please, the last thing you want to do with your native plants is turn it into beautiful English garden rich soil.
Yeah, because you actually will make it harder for yourself to keep weeds out.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here that says, let me.
Sorry, wait. One thing though, our native forests tend to like forest litter, leaves, twigs, small things like that are slow release forms of fertilizer, if you will, organic fertilizer. Mm-hmm. So some of the best things you can do is throw your dead leaves into your garden at the end of the year. Not only will it give places for caterpillars to pupate, but it will also add nutrients that will leach out of those leaves as they decompose. So, sorry.
Oh, there is a question from someone who lives next door to somebody who feeds deer and wonders what she can do as she tries to turn her 2 acres of lawn into a native paradise.
Whew, yeah, deer. They are adorable, but they are a problem as we feed them and we bring in more and more deer. Deer will preferentially eat our native plants, which then preferentially leaves space for more invasive plants. Higher deer herds are causing health issues for themselves and then spreading some of those diseases to our other animals. So yeah, I have no suggestions. I guess my biggest suggestion is voice your concerns to the DNR and to our political entities to say we should not be overpopulating our deer. They cause problems back east. They bring in deer ticks. You can look at areas where there are way too many deer being kept on the landscape because of feeding, and that causes huge ecological disasters, let alone the health issues that deer ticks are causing and such. So
the best thing that you can probably do is put up a fence.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be incredibly expensive, but And there are designs out there that you can research online. There are also deer repellents that work. You have to be religious about putting them on, but they do protect plants. I have a question. I missed the origin of the info Sigrid shared just before the session started. I'm not sure what that refers to.
Might have been the Kisma website where I have my native plant list.
Okay, well, I do have the Kisma site in the chat, so
yeah, here's the native plant list that I created with all the leaves marking where that species can be bought and where it's native to.
Right.
If it doesn't have a leaf, then it's not native here.
Okay. And a lot of the discussion in the beginning centered around some of Doug Tallamy's work in his books. So
yes,
always a good reference.
So yeah, actually, I just realized I'm gonna have to fix this leaf. Bog goldenrod is native here. Don't know why there isn't a leaf in that row. I'll definitely have to check this again.
No, we're not. We're not grading you.
Yeah, I just hate it when I find errors. But here's the source of my list. So I took Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, where he has several species lists in the back. So I used the Mid-Atlantic and Middle States and the Midwest and Eastern Great Plains lists. I took his lists and condensed them by using Steve Chatty's Plants of the Copper Country. If any of you guys, can you see this? If any of you guys have ever seen this little book, this is a really awesome resource for finding what's native specifically to our area. And then I use the U of M, University of Michigan online herbarium and the Prairie Moon Nursery and Prairie Nursery maps to figure out all of these different species where they're native to.
Okay. Next question, is yellow mullein harmful?
Yeah. Mullein really does a good job of creating florets that run. It's not native here. Bees, generalist insects will use it, but just because you see an insect on a plant doesn't mean, oh, good, I've done my job, because it's usually the generalist insects that are doing that, which means that are using that plant, which means that that plant's taking up space from a specialist insect that probably needed a different plant there. And those generalist insects aren't going to necessarily help with diversity because they're ubiquitous. So really, we need to be focusing on plants that will feed specialists. And if the specialists will eat it, then generalists will as well. So mullein takes over. Michigan Nature Association had to remove big patches of mullein on a trail system of theirs that they manage. If it's left to its own, I had to remove it. It invaded in my knotweed area, and I had to remove the mullein. They're super easy to pull, but it's definitely not something you want to have around.
Okay. Does solarization take longer in wooded areas than for lawn and full sun?
I would say it's not whether it's wooded or not, but it's how aggressively rhizomatous the plant is on how long it's been established there, meaning how much energy is stored in the root system, the rhizomes of that plant. So the older the colony of plants that you're wanting to remove, the longer solarization is going to take. Most of these plants that we're dealing with, that technique is useful for, can grow in the shade. Like goutweed grows fine in the shade, vinca grows fine in the shade. So it's not a sun versus shade. It's a rhizomatous species. So that's why you have to smother it for longer. And the older the colony, the more energy that's stored there, the longer you have to smother it for it to not keep having energy to pop itself up again.
Okay. And I'm down to the bottom of the list. I hope I haven't missed anybody. Black locust. Murder on site, or can it be managed for firewood and poles?
I believe it resprouts. I don't manage black locust yet. There is a fellow who would like me to start because he cleared all of his forests off a hill slope. planted some black locust because they were shorter. They've grown taller, taken over his hill slope, and he's got himself a mess now. Black locust is native to just south of Michigan, and so it's not a priority species to me. I've definitely seen where it's become problematic, and that's usually where people have removed the competing forest species there. I think it's one of those invasives that's going to, because it's just from south of Michigan, it's essentially it's climatized for up here now as it's gotten warmer up here.
Mhm.
So I don't feel as strongly about black locust as some do. I feel like there's probably insects that are going to make their way from the south up to the black locust, and that's where they're from, and so they'll just find their species that they know.
Okay.
That's my feeling on it. I have a lot, limited resources, a lot of invasives. Black locust isn't one of my priorities.
Well, I think we'll take one more question before we leave for the night. What are your thoughts on using glyphosate to kill off a long-term vinca before smothering?
In general, I think chemicals should be your last resource, last weapon of choice. Glyphosate has been shown in the literature to change microbial activity in the soil. It is being shown to do other things that I think haven't been measured up to this point. I actually started accumulating some database on literature on the impacts of glyphosate. I tend not to use chemicals except in my research to do comparisons of things. I feel that that hard work replaces the need for chemicals, and for something like vinca, I think the smothering approach, if you're trying to get insects back into your area and you're trying to get natives to grow there, I feel like putting chemicals should be the last thing you want to try.
Okay. Well, Sigrid, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
I really hope that was helpful. It's a lot of information, but I wanted to point out that my talk isn't going to be, the end all. You're not going to have had a final list of all the species. There's just no time. I had no time to show you every single species you shouldn't be growing, let alone every single species you could be growing. But I tried to give you places where you could go to get that information. And you can always contact me at Kisma, kisma.up@gmail.com, or I'm on Michigan Tech's website.
A PDF of your presentation is in the chat if anybody would like to download it and take a look at it. And just for your information, in April, the Keweenaw Wild Ones are going to be sponsoring their Native Plant Symposium in cooperation with the Keweenaw Garden Club and Keweenaw Land Trust. And I hope you all stay tuned for more information on that. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
It's been great having you, Sigrid.